Also, okay.
Okay, everybody. We're a couple minutes after the hour here. I think it's time to get going. So thanks all for turning out on this beautiful October day. I can't believe it's October already. I am Assistant Professor Peter Neff in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. And we're super happy to have another rendition of the annual Kuehnast Lecture. So in 1992, the Kuehnast family established an endowment in the Soil, Water, and Climate Department in memory of Earl Kuehnast, former Minnesota State climatologist. And that endowment has supported over the years students in climatology and meteorology research, and it also supports this lecture series. So thank you very much to the family. And if I might ask family members to stand up and say hello, it's great to see a number of you here, and we can we look forward to chatting with you after our speaker, Ed Brook, shared some of his science with you. So it's been a big year for my research group. I'm an ice core scientist like Ed is. And I just wanted to thank my 3 students who have been supporting ice core and polar science projects over the years. So Demi Hoffman is a PhD student who worked with me and supports the COLDEX, the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration, that you'll hear a lot more about from Ed, I believe. And Bridget Hall, who's helped on our Mount Waddington ice core drilling project last July in British Columbia. And Julia Andreasen, who's also a PhD student who helped both on the Mount Waddington project and a very crazy expedition to Antarctica on a South Korean icebreaker that I'd be happy to chat with you more about. And if you want to read more about it, there's a Science News article about it at the back there, and you can copies printed out. So we'll have a few words from Brent Williams, our chair in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, before we introduce Ed and hear from him for the next 40 or 50 minutes. So I'll just hand over to Brent, and yeah, I'll have a few remarks about the department.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'm just on here. Okay, great. All right, thanks, Peter. Welcome everybody. It's exciting. We have each semester we do a large lecture, and it's our chance to get everyone together and a lot of alumni as well. So it's great to see a lot of faces I only see this time of year. Not that I've been doing this very long. I completed my first year in this position after Carl Rosen did 13 years. So we'll see if I have another dozen. Yeah, I'm just going to start with this is some artwork that an undergraduate student did, Ben Porter, depicting for our Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. Actually, Mason, would you mind being We have some t-shirts. Thank you. So yeah, if you're interested in that, reach out. We could get another order in. Okay? Graduate students in the land and atmospheric sciences program put those together. This year's new class of students is, I think, last year we only had a couple new students starting with us, and this year we have 11 new graduate students. So we're really excited to have a big cohort this year. And if you're in this room, welcome, and we're excited to have you join us here in soil, water, and climate. And our graduate program, Land and Atmospheric Sciences. I just realized that we like to use "and" in all of our acronyms. So this is LAAS, and one of the A's is "and," and then soil, water, and climate is SWAC, and one of that A is "and." The dean, I'm in a current battle with the dean about whether we should have an A there or not. They use SWC. So that's a battle I'm fighting for the department. And I hope the grad program doesn't become LAS. There's something unique about that. So we also just recently awarded our scholarships. So these are all departmental and LAS program graduate scholarships and fellowships that are donors, some of which are with us. We see the Earl Kuehnast Family Endowment was just awarded to Renzo. I know Satish is in the room, in the back of the room here. That fund supported Yasasina. So thank you so much to all of the families and endowments for your support. And these are the students that are currently benefiting from your kind support. I have just a couple updates on our faculty in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. So I'm gonna appropriately, both of these are kind of more on our climate research side. So Peter Neff, who opened this up here and is the hosting here, he was promoted to a tenure track position in our department. Congratulations, Peter. And I'm not sure if Heidi's is joining us remotely today or not. My guess is not. She's pretty fully engaged in other things this year. So she's actually on assignment at the White House, which is quite an honor for her and for her group in the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. She's serving as the Assistant Director for Climate Services with White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and also as the Deputy Director of Services with the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So a couple different hats that she's wearing there in DC currently. So that's pretty exciting. I'm also going to announce we have quite a few retirements currently. So Tracy Twine is retiring, and Tracy was one of our climate scientists on the modeling side of things. Peter Snyder is also retiring, who is also on the modeling side of our climate research. And Jay Bell just completed a phased retirement in our department, and Jay studied wetland soils. And John Baker, who I know is with us, I see fingers pointing. John is also retiring. Congratulations, John. I don't know if Tracy's not here currently, but yeah, John has served. I don't know, as a research leader, I don't know how many years you did. 23 years as a research leader. So we're currently in the process with the USDA ARS program located here, Soil and Water Management Group, looking for a new research lead, but those are some big shoes to fill. John, certainly going to be missed, and as well Tracy and Jay and Peter. With Tracy and Jay and Peter, one comment I'll say is that they're all amazing instructors. And I think our department is going to have a little bit, a bit of a hole there that we're currently working with the college to get two new positions, faculty positions, one more in the wetlands and hydrology kind of area, and then one in more on the climatology side of things. So, but it really is. I've heard from students and alumni and other colleagues of Tracy and Jay and Peter about how amazing their teaching was. So that's a tradition we want to keep continue on going forward. Okay. I just have a few slides now. It's just some pictures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our research and some current things, exciting things going on. But not go into too much depth on any of it, so we can get to our speaker here. But you know, this department, when I first started a year ago, soil, water, and climate, it seems like quite different things and different disciplines. You know, how do those groups come together and work together, and what brings them together? And really what I was going to, for this fall lecture, the Kuehnast Lecture is typically in the climate area and climatology. And in our fall, we focus a little bit more on the soil side of things. But as I think about it, I was trying to think about all the different work we do. The climate part of this is really what connects our department across every single research group. You know, there we have some folks like Tracy and Peter that modeled climate and future climate systems. But every single faculty member, every single research group in our department is more and more focused on climate issues. Those issues might be, you know, how are we going to deal with agricultural systems in a changing climate system? What does that mean for our soil health? What does it mean for pollution dynamics, not just in the air, but in the plants, in the ground, in the soil? So really, everybody in our Department of Soil, Water, and Climate is doing some version of climate research. And I've just highlighted some different areas then. It's important to know what our soil types are. We do that research. We do work at the nexus of agriculture, the need for growing more food and sustainable food, while taking care of the environment and limiting pollution. We go and do studies on entire ecosystems. So here's an example in northern Minnesota where we have where there's been a Department of Energy funded historically research where we do basically go into the real environment and make little control chambers where we can change the climate in each of those systems and think about how is this forest going to respond 50 years from now or 100 years from now with changing temperatures and carbon dioxide. Precision agriculture is going to be a big piece of how we deal with a changing climate system. Irrigation, of course, and manure management, our wetlands, our changing climate system, our changing weather systems, water quality and water runoff, the microbiology of the soils. All of these things change as environments change temperatures and precipitation patterns, and those climate change is changing all of these things. One thing I'll point out, I'm not sure if Kim Sue is here, but usually we talk about global warming, but this is global worming. So the movement of worms through a changing climate system and invasive species take effect. Kim Sue taught me that word. I did not know about global warming before getting to join a department like this with diverse. A couple other highlights here on the climate side. I've already mentioned Heidi's work in DC this year, but the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership lining the entire back wall of this room at the moment and spread throughout the room. Such an integral part of our department, but in itself a really growing program across the state of Minnesota to help for a lot of different things, but really climate resiliency, working with Minnesota towns and communities and farmers across the board, planning for changes that are going to take place in the future. We do a lot of work coming down from the atmosphere, not just from the soil up, but coming from the atmosphere down. So Dylan Malay's work using satellite information to learn new things about gases that are emitted into our atmosphere. that work being funded through NASA and NOAA with some really large projects. Using tall towers that stand over these ecosystems. So instead of controlling a small little chamber, you can actually take a really tall tower and measure what's coming out from not just one little group of trees, but entire forests or entire agricultural areas. And so that's a project that Tim Griffiths and John Baker recently had a $7 million project funded using a series of these tall towers across the Midwest to get a better idea about our greenhouse gas emissions from our agricultural practices specifically. And a lot of work through MCAP and other collaborators on running climate projections for the future of Minnesota, but not just how is the temperature going to change in Minnesota, very specific things about the temporal pattern and very small spatial resolution. So on my farm, how are things expected to change? That's a really challenging thing when we talk about the difference between weather and climate. Climate gets modeled in a different way, so getting that spatial resolution is a really big challenge. We have a AI climate project that Dave Mulla is helping lead, working around using artificial intelligence to help us learn about making climate decisions. And then lastly, I'll point out here, this idea of digging deep into the earth to get at information that's buried from the past that can be used to help inform our decisions of the future. How does our climate system work? A lot of those keys are trapped deep in the earth, including in the ice, which is what we're all here today to learn about. So I'm going to hand it back to Peter to introduce our speaker for today. Thanks.
And before I forget again, I'll just apologize that we were supposed to have our beloved Minnesota climate expert Mark Seeley here to say a few words about Earl Kuehnast. And unfortunately, Mark had an emergency dental issue this morning that had to be resolved today. So he sends his apologies, and we'll try again to get him next year. So yeah, I have the pleasure of introducing distinguished professor from Oregon State University, Ed Brook, an ice core scientist, paleoclimatologist, and somebody I've known since early in my career as an ice core scientist. I work very closely with him now as part of the NSF Center for Oldest Ice Exploration, which I suspect you'll hear a fair bit more about here shortly. Ed's background is in geology, so he did his bachelor's in geology at Duke University, master's at University of Montana, before doing a PhD in chemical oceanography at MIT Woods Hole Joint Program. He is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, recipient of the Oscar Medal of the European Geophysical Union, and one of the world leading ice core scientists. So we're very pleased to have him. And although I don't expect everybody to have an ice core background in the audience, we are all here in Minnesota, so we have some understanding of the cold winter, and hopefully that can be a through line to hear what Ed has to share about climate lessons from ice cores. So thanks, Ed, so much for being here with us.
Great. Can you hear me? The microphone working? It's on. Yes?
Here's some.
Yes. Just on. How about that? Better?
I think you're muted down here.
No.
This one.
How about that? There we go. That's good.
Awesome.
Know about ice, but not about microphones. Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation to come speak with you. It's been nice to be here for a while, meet some new people, catch up with some old friends. So very happy to talk to you about what we're doing with ice cores. The title here is Climate Lessons from Ice Cores. I've tried to put some things in this presentation that are sort of foundational and fundamental for maybe for people who don't think about this all the time, and also some new science that we are doing now. And Peter's doing something.
Just hiding this obnoxious thing.
Oh, I can't.
You'd think
see
with
it.
COLDEX having Zoom meetings 3 times a week, we'd figure this out, but.
Okay, and yeah, okay, so here we go. And the first thing I'm going to do is a little bit of acknowledgement. So I'm at the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. Great place to work. Most of the work you're going to see is supported by the National Science Foundation. And some of what I'll talk about is from this Science and Technology Center that I'm director of, called the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration. It's a 5-year program that we hope will be renewed for another 5 years. And what we're after is the oldest ice on the planet. I will speak a little bit about that. The people at the top are, as a group photo, I'm sort of interested in the history of group photos in science. This is a group photo from a 2021 meeting in Switzerland, and this is most of the international ice core science community coming together for a meeting every few years. I put this here just because ice coring is one of those fields where you need a lot of different people to do different things in order to get your samples and get your data. And some of what I'm going to show you comes from a bunch of international projects. One of the gratifying things about working in this field actually has been how collaborative it is. And they like to get together and have meetings in nice places. So I guess if this is lessons, this is the lesson plan. And I don't always stick to those, but we'll try. First thing I'd just like to do is talk about some basic things about ice cores, about how they work, how we collect them, and a little bit about some of those details, not too much. And I'd like to talk about what we could call the long view from ice cores, the 800,000-year record of greenhouse gases and climate, what we learn about that, some of the puzzles that we find, and then talk about this Center for Oldest Ice Exploration search for an actually successful discovery of much older ice. And then I know that a lot of you think about things on much, much shorter time scales than this. So if there's time, I'd like to zoom in on some other kinds of work we've done over the last several decades on rapid changes in climate that occur naturally and the consequences and interactions between the biosphere that are related there. I'm going to talk mostly, I'm going to talk about climate and greenhouse gases primarily. There's lots of other things to learn about from ice cores. My expertise in my lab works on the greenhouse gas records, which are kind of unique. And in the interest of time, I'll focus mostly on that. I'm going to start with some sort of basic stuff about ice cores, but even before that, I'll just show this slide. I think very familiar to most people. This is the Keeling curve in red there, the increase in atmospheric CO2 measured at Mauna Loa, the global CO2 record there in black, and the record of atmospheric methane in, I guess that's green or blue, can't see it from here. The Keeling curve starts just before 1960. Direct measurements of methane in the atmosphere start in the 1980s. And these are the fundamental data that are telling us that the atmosphere is changing, humans are impacting the atmosphere. If somebody wants to talk about it later, the interesting sort of change in the methane slope is one of those mysteries that we have with these data. But my point here is that humans have been directly observing the composition of the atmosphere and watching it change since essentially the 1960s, a little bit earlier. So anything we know about this history before this time comes from the ice core record. In fact, it's very impactful. And we'll talk about that in a few seconds. Ice core scientists go all over the world to collect ice cores. The ones that go back pretty far in time are primarily from the polar regions. So in this map is showing locations for what we call deep ice cores, ice cores that for the most part penetrate through the last ice age or older in Greenland and in Antarctica. Now, it's not the only place people collect ice cores. Peter's been collecting ice cores in other locations in the Northern Hemisphere. There are places in the tropics with ice cores. But for the work that I do on sort of global scale processes, reconstructions of the atmospheric history, it's these Antarctic and Greenland ice cores that are important. The bottom sketch is a sort of idealized version of an ice sheet, just showing accumulation in the center, flow out on a sort of what we would call a dome out in either direction. And when you're collecting ice cores, you mostly want to be in the center of one of these regions where the accumulation of ice layer by layer stays sort of vertical, and you can interpret the stratigraphy pretty easily, and all the ice originates more or less at the same elevation. There are unconventional places that we go, and I'll be talking about them later, around the ice margins, around the edges, where occasionally you get old ice preserved in places where the topography or some other factor keeps the ice on land. And it's actually those places where we're finding the oldest ice, but they're also interesting sometimes for other reasons. This is just some photographs. On the upper left is an ice core site at the South Pole where a group of Americans drilled an ice core, just to give you an idea what the field work is like. In these environments, it's pretty much white, fairly stark, but really cool landscapes. At the bottom is a snow pit, which has been dug into the snow in West Antarctica and dug actually on both sides. You can see the sun coming through the back, and it's showing you the layering. And this is an important sort of illustration that in many places there are actual annual layers which can be counted. And that's one way that we get the age scales for these ice cores. On the upper right is a diagram of what we call the firn, which is the upper, say, 50 to 100 meters of the ice sheet where the snow is gradually being buried and recrystallizing and compacting to form solid ice. And this is an extremely important aspect of the ice core record, understanding this particular material, because it's in the firn, the atmosphere, the air above the firn circulates and diffuses through the snowpack, but eventually gets trapped in bubbles when the solid ice forms at depth in the ice sheet. And this is the reason why ice cores preserve air. And this is the reason why you have bubbles in glacier ice. And this is a very unique property of ice cores as a paleoclimate record. It's really the only real paleoclimate record where we think we're actually preserving something from the past rather than looking at an indirect measure of climate. We're preserving the air bubbles. And collecting ice cores isn't easy. We have to use very large drills that are specialized for drilling into the ice sheet. We have to figure out how to get the ice home without melting it, planes and ships and all kinds of other things. And then we, in the United States, we store all of the polar ice in a place in Denver called the National Science Foundation Ice Core Facility. And you can see ice cores racked up here in tubes. And one of the things people who don't work in this field don't always know is that there's lots of this stuff. If you are interested in studying ice, you can get ice from the ice core facility, and they're happy to help you figure out what you might want to work on. So we've been collecting cores since the 60s, and a lot of them are still there. It's still very valuable to work on. My most cited paper is on an ice core that was collected when I was 4 years old. So it's actually a really important archive for science. It's also cold when you're collecting ice cores, so if you can't tell, that's Peter. Peter does incredible outreach from the field that's reached probably millions of people, and that's very important too. And but it's fun field work, but it's also quite difficult. And I see at least one other person here who's been in Antarctica in the audience. In my lab, we do a lot of analytical geochemistry to extract air from polar ice, and we have to build a lot of specialized equipment for that because the samples are pretty small with respect to what most people measure. And so I won't talk about all these slides. I've made this talk for this slide for a different presentation, but it's just to illustrate that a lot of what we do is actually laboratory work and mass spectrometry, gas chromatography, laser spectroscopy to measure things in the ice. And I should say, of course, I'm going to be talking mostly about greenhouse gases, but ice cores collect all kinds of information. The isotopic composition of the ice itself is an important temperature proxy. We can measure dust that accumulates in the ice. We can measure the thickness of the annual layers and get the snowfall rate. We can measure aerosols that are deposited in the ice. We can measure the physical properties of the ice. And all of these things give us proxy measurements related to climate change. Ice cores relative to other paleoclimate archives like marine sediments or lake sediments, for example, actually have a fair amount of ice per year, which means that they can provide a great deal of resolution or detailed time history that you don't always get from other kinds of materials. Of course, they're only in the polar regions, and so when you're trying to study the local climate, that's what you're learning about. The first deep ice core was collected at a place called Camp Century in Greenland. I believe this was the first one. This is actually an under ice Cold War facility. And it was drilled with an electric drill that was powered by a nuclear reactor, I believe. So interesting kind of tidbit there. And this is a picture of the Camp Century drilling. I like this picture because they started this project in 1963, which is the year I was born. So it's kind of a cool coincidence. And on the bottom left, well, up on the top left, you can see where Camp Century is there in Western Greenland. The bottom left is a plot of the oxygen 18, oxygen 16 ratio in the Camp Century ice core. And it actually penetrated through the Holocene and down into the last ice age. So colder is to the left on this graph. And you can see the little wiggles during the cold period. And those are actually real climate events, which I'll talk about at the end if I get there in time. And so even back at this time, we were actually learning things that become quite important later on in the history of ice core. All right, so that was some of the introductory stuff. Back to the greenhouse gases. So this is now a plot showing the records of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide going back to about 1600. And this comes from a place in Antarctica called Law Dome, where the snowfall rate is maybe about 1 meter of ice per year. And so they get really, really detailed data. And you've often have probably seen plots like this showing the increase in greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. And most of those plots are plotting these data from the Law Dome ice core. It's an Australian project. If you see in blue on these graphs is the modern atmospheric record. And then you can see, particularly for CO2 and methane, how that modern atmospheric record blends really nicely into the ice core record. So one of the verifications that the measurements in the air bubbles are accurate. And again, this is the only way we know about the impact of humans on the atmosphere prior to the advent of direct measurements. So there were, sporadic measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere before 1960, but nothing systematic like what Keeling started. Okay, and every time I make a talk, I have to make this graph again, which I did the other day, just because, if you want to be accurate, concentration is still going up. Sometimes people ask, how do you know if this is due to humans? It's pretty clear, but one of the ways we know is by measuring the isotopic composition of the gases. In this case, this is the delta 13C of CO2, so the 13 carbon, 12 carbon ratio. And it's very, very clear from those measurements that as the carbon dioxide goes up, the ratio gets more negative, and that's a clear signature of fossil fuel burning. And in fact, you never see ratios this negative in any part of the ice core record. And similar things can be seen for methane and nitrous oxide. So if you need to convince somebody that we know that these gases are due to humans, this is where to go. Okay, so that's sort of my basic intro to ice cores. We could obviously talk more about that, but I'd like to move on to looking at some of the data and results and talking about their significance. And first talking about this very long view of climate history going back millions of years. So this is a picture of another ice core site. This is Dome C, which is circled in red on the map of Antarctica. The colors indicate ice velocity. So the velocity of the ice at Dome C is very slow. So Antarctica is actually made up of a group of coalescing ice domes. And we're sitting here on what's called Dome C or Dome Concordia. And this is the place where the oldest continuous ice core has been collected. This is a European project. It's called the Epica Dome Sea Ice Core, European project for ice core in Antarctica. And if you've seen the 800,000 year climate records from Antarctica, you're seeing the Dome Sea data. There's actually another ice core that our Japanese colleagues have collected that's slightly younger, but shows all the same features. And so paleoclimatologists like to look at lots of wiggly lines, so I'm going to have to do a little bit more of that. This is the Dome Sea record. 800,000 years is on the left to 0 on the right, and we're plotting a few different things. So now nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, and methane in the middle. And then the dust flux to this ice core based on measuring dust in the ice. And then above that, the ratio of deuterium to hydrogen in the water molecule, which is a proxy for temperature. And these are oriented so that warm conditions are up and cold conditions are down. And if you look carefully at the dust plus measurements, you'll see that the scale is reversed because it's dustier during cold periods and less dusty during warm periods. And then on the bottom is something from the ocean. If you know about paleoceanography, you'd be familiar with this curve, but it's the isotopic composition of shells in the ocean bottom, which changes as the Earth's glaciers and ice sheets grow and shrink, and it's plotted in such a way that interglacial is up and glacial is down. And it's not a perfect proxy for ice volume. It also has a component of temperature change in it, but it can be used as a general index for the ice age cycles. And so what we're seeing here on this plot is the ice age cycles, the slow changes in the Earth's orbit that are impacting the Earth system to create the patterns that we're seeing in temperature, greenhouse gases, and changes in global ice volume. Now, one thing, of course, to say about this is to just compare the modern concentrations of these gases with what we see over that time period. And so the blue and the red lines show where we are or where we were a couple of years ago when I made this slide with CO2 and methane. And this is, very, very strong evidence, of course, that the current changes in the atmosphere are unprecedented on this time scale, both in terms of their speed, which I may come back to later if I have time, but also in terms of the magnitude. So this plot is very foundational in paleoclimatology because carbon dioxide and methane are the main greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and they are contributing clearly to the temperature changes that happen over this time period. And one of the primary observations, other than the fact that modern atmosphere is higher than what we see here, is that the linkage between warm climates and higher greenhouse gases, cold climates and lower greenhouse gases. In more detail, that's quite complicated. We know that the Earth's orbit changes, the tilt of the Earth changes, the way direction that the axis points changes, and the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit change over time. And we know that these patterns that we see are consistent with the timing of those variations. But in fact, why those orbital variations get translated into climate changes is one of the sort of big efforts of paleoclimatology over the last many, many decades, understanding how small changes in the Earth's orbit are actually manifest in large changes in the climate system. Because remember, when we go from an ice age to a warm period, we're going from periods where we were covered by ice here in Minnesota and a large ice sheet in North America into warmer periods where all the ice disappeared. And so there's feedback system and feedbacks in the Earth system that are taking those variations in the Earth's orbit that then cause variations in solar radiation around the Earth, impact the climate system, impact the ocean, land, ice, and biota, and then feedback onto the biogeochemical systems that control greenhouse gases, and ultimately resulting in the temperature change and greenhouse gas patterns that we see. The general consensus has been that about half of the glacial interglacial change is due to the greenhouse effect of these changing greenhouse gases, and something like the other 50% is due to changes in the Earth's surface albedo caused by ice sheet growth and decay. So, that's sort of the basic picture, but actually understanding all of the different linkages and feedbacks that control why these gases change is sort of the $64 million question in climate science. And I'm not going to try to answer all of that, but I would like to talk about one thing that has sort of bled over into discussions of modern climate change. It sort of faded away a little bit now, but was a popular thing for climate skeptics to pick on a while ago. And that has to do with the timing, I'll go back to this slide, the timing of temperature change with respect to the changes in greenhouse gases. And so, some people call this the chicken and egg problem. The issue was that when in the early ice core records, it looked like CO2 changed a little bit after temperature. So we looked at these temperature records, we looked at the carbon dioxide records, and there's a little bit of a phasing problem because the gases are trapped below the surface of the ice sheet, so they're a little younger than the ice they're trapped in. And so there were some papers published that said the phasing is this way, and then a bunch of climate skeptics got on that and said, well, if that's the case, then CO2 doesn't affect climate. You guys are full of it. It turned out that the data just weren't very good, and newer ice core records that provided a lot more detail showed pretty clearly that when you look at climate change and temperature change and greenhouse gas change over the last glacial to interglacial transition, like about 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, and you compare the phasing, the timing of CO2 and temperature very, very carefully, it's actually sort of locked together. You can't really tell whether one is driving the other. And if you look at the phasing of carbon dioxide change and the best reconstructions of global temperature, you actually sort of see that the global temperature lags a little bit behind CO2. So I think from the perspective of the sort of chicken and egg question in climate skeptics, it's a non-issue. It's sort of not really a well-placed question anyway, because the Earth system is all linked together and CO2 doesn't change by on its own. But it's something that was addressed in a series of papers prior to 2020. But like I said, when we actually try to understand all the different reasons that when you go into an ice age, carbon dioxide goes down and methane goes down, that's where we get into the complexities of the Earth system, and particularly the complexities of the carbon cycle that control atmospheric CO2. This is one of those diagrams from the IPCC, which talks about all the different carbon fluxes that control atmospheric CO2. And we are fairly certain, fairly convinced that the interglacial changes have to involve changes in ocean carbon storage, because that's where the big place where you can change the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But there are a lot of internal mechanisms within the ocean that could do this, and establishing them, which ones are important, if one is more important than the other, how all of that works is really been something that's been going on for many, many decades, really, since people first found CO2 variations in ice cores. And I'd say that the jury is still out on having a completely self-consistent explanation of why CO2 goes up and down. The problem is not finding a mechanism, it's that there are so many that determining which ones are actually acting is fairly difficult. We've done some work on this, trying to trace carbon dioxide with carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratios in CO2 in the atmosphere, and a couple of papers listed there. And I'd say it doesn't produce a completely neat solution. It can rule out certain scenarios, we could talk more about that in detail. I don't want to go too far into that topic, but suffice it to say that there's still quite a work to do on the mechanisms involved. Now, Getting older ice would be really nice. And the reason is that despite the super long, really great 800,000 year record, it has a limit in the sense that it doesn't extend far enough back in time to get into what we think are warmer climate periods. Like we'd really like to understand a time period that's more like today, or more like what we're headed towards, really, which is what we probably should be thinking about. So this is a diagram showing the last 5 million years of Earth history. And there are a few different things plotted here. That long carbon dioxide record is in blue. That benthic oxygen isotope record is in black here in the middle. A reconstruction of global mean surface temperature is at the bottom. This comes from my colleague Peter Clark at Oregon State University. So over the last 5 million years, we're fairly certain that the Earth is cooled. In this record, it's on the order of 6 degrees or so on average. And the cycles of climate have gotten both longer and larger. So one of the main observations from paleoclimatology is that climate cycles go from 40,000 year cycles to about 1.2 billion years. There's a transition called the mid-Pleistocene transition, and then you move into climate cycles of 100,000 years. This by itself is a mystery. You can see it reflected in the temperature reconstruction. We'd really like, and so understanding what happens here at the MPT is one thing that we're interested in. Another is that we'd really like to understand these warmer periods. So the other box on this slide is the mid-Pliocene warm period. And this is a time period where sea level might have been about 10 to 20 meters higher than today. And it's also a time period where the red data on the top come into play. So the red data are indirect indicators of the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. Those come from the chemical composition of, primarily chemical composition of marine fossils, either the isotope ratios of boron or the carbon isotopic composition of a compound called alkanone that is deposited by a particular organism, and some other kinds of data. And these are very scattered and quite uncertain, but the best estimates from these is that this mid-Pliocene warm period had carbon dioxide around 400 parts per million, which is just about what we are at today. And that's often used as a target for climate modeling and kind of an index. I won't call it an analog for today because I think that's probably too strong a term. These past periods aren't necessarily analogs for today or the future, but it should tell us something about that time period. But like I said, that CO2 reconstructions are very, very uncertain. They actually range from quite low values to quite high values. I'm not even plotting them all on this plot, so there are more that would be up even higher. And so one of the big objectives of the ice core community is to get ice that goes back further, because we can get the atmospheric records really, really clearly. We can get climate records from Antarctica much more clearly. And the challenge is to find a place where older ice would exist. And so there's a bunch of different groups trying to do that. So here's the Antarctic continent, and all of the locations on this are places where different groups of people are thinking about or trying or starting to drill ice cores to get back at least to 1.5 million years. And the reason they want to get back that far is so they can get through this mid-Pleistocene transition into this period. The group that I'm have the honor to lead is also trying to go back quite a bit further. We'll talk about that in a minute. So there's a European project here at Dome C that thinks they can go older. There's some Australians drilling there as well. The Chinese have a project that might go forward. The Japanese are also looking, and part of the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration is flying airplanes near the South Pole and doing radar imagery of the ice sheet to look for a place where we might drill an ice core. These traditional ice cores that go back in the center of the ice sheet, we don't think we could get beyond 1.5 million years. There's just no way that ice will be preserved. It's going to be either melted off the bed or blowing out or folded up in ways that wouldn't be interpretable. But we do hope eventually to collect one of these cores. It's very, very hard to find a place where the ice would be this old. It's not a matter of going deeper. We can drill to the bottom. It's a matter of finding a location where the ice flow and accumulation has left that ice behind rather than have it be lost to the system. The Antarctic, the ice sheet has been here for something like 37 million years, so that's not a problem. There's been ice here for a long time, but it's just very, very rare to preserve ice that is that old. So stay tuned. Our European colleagues might know next year how old their ice is at the bottom of their core. What we've been doing right now, which is pushing the ice core ages back much further, is working in this location called Allen Hills at one of these ice margin sites. At the time that graph was made, we had 2.7 million year ice from Allen Hills. So Allen Hills is one of these margin sites. There's old ice sort of trapped in the mountains, and it turns out to be incredibly cool, and the ice there is extraordinarily useful because it's so old, but it's not in stratigraphic order. It turns out that the process of getting ice into these mountain regions has folded it in lots of complicated ways. If you're a geologist, you maybe studied folded rocks. Imagine studying a folded rock where you can't see any of the layers. And that's really what we're dealing with. So it's very hard to interpret in detail, but we're getting better at understanding it. And it's an interesting place to work. So this is the McMurdo Dry Valleys. If you're familiar with Antarctica at all, McMurdo Station is here. Allen Hills is up there in the corner of this map. Because the Antarctic projections are sometimes funny, I've had to flip it around here to plot it up there. The Allen Hills is this nunatak sticking out of the ice sheet. And along the edge of this nunatak, ice flow has brought old ice near the surface. So we can drill down a few hundred meters, and it turns out that which is the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration, lots and lots of people working on this, have found ice with ages up to 5 to 6 million years. So it's quite extraordinary. Right? When we started, we wrote this proposal to build this center. We said 5 million years is our goal because you have to have a big audacious goal. And I didn't think there would be ice this old, but it turns out there is. And we'll talk a little bit about the data that come from this in the next few slides. The red dots are a bunch of different ice cores. We have several that go back this old, and we're going back for several more seasons of drilling to look for more ice. And again, imagine this if you're a geologist, this is like a very deformed mountain range that we're drilling down into. It's a little bit of a fishing expedition to figure out where the old ice is preserved. And one of the things we're trying to do is get a better handle on the sub-ice structure to help us do that. How do we know that this is really old? And it turns out that the way we know that is from a technique called argon atmospheric dating. I guess that's what I could call it. And this was developed by Michael Bender, who was my postdoc supervisor now at Princeton. And what Michael realized is that the amount of argon-40 in the atmosphere changes with time. And I mean, geologists knew that already, but he realized that he could measure this change. And argon-40 is a decay product of potassium-40. I learned this morning that this process was discovered at the University of Minnesota in 1948 by Alan Deere. This is pretty cool because this is a incredibly important dating technique in geology. And normally we measure argon and potassium in rocks and figure out how old they are. But in this case, the crust is always degassing argon into the atmosphere, which means the argon-40 in the atmosphere is always going up. Nothing destroys atmospheric argon. It doesn't escape to space. It's just increasing. And so we can measure the ratio of argon-40 to a stable isotope of argon-40, 38. And we have to correct a little bit for a gravitational fractionation that happens in the burn, and we also measure argon-36. And this is the calibration slope of that measurement from Michael's original paper. And so we extrapolate that calibration back in time, and we have to assume that the slope is constant. We're working a little bit on trying to find ways to calibrate it more. And that's the way we get the age of the old ice. This is what the Allen Hills looks like. I think there was a slide like this earlier on the screen. It's a beautiful place to work. It's pretty windy and kind of cold. It's a blue ice area, which means that the ice is losing mass normally. Sometimes you get drifting snow, but normally you're walking on solid ice. And the place where we were drilling in this picture is way back there at the edge, right against that Nunatak. This is maybe gonna work. I'm trying to find my cursor. It's
Over here, so night.
there we go. There we go. Yeah, so this is what we call the blue ice drill. It's a really big ice core drill, so we can get really large samples. And just a little bit of a time lapse photograph of or video of people collecting ice cores. They just brought one to the surface, and they're gonna push it out real fast. And they're working on ice in the back. This nice big ice core weighs about 80 pounds or so. They're kind of hard to move around. This is an unusual drill. Sometimes we use smaller ones, but this is to get very large samples to do like the dating methods that we were talking about. So just a little bit about field work. Here's a diagram from one of the cores that we have the most extensive ages from. So depth on the y-axis, carbon age on the right. This goes back to 4 million years. This is just the bottom of this core. And clearly you can see that it's not in order, right? Age should be going, just increasing nicely with depth. Instead, we're seeing lots of what are folds or shear zones. And so what we can do with this ice is measure things in each individual piece and build up what we're calling snapshots of climate. So we're not getting a continuous record. We're not going to see the orbital wiggles yet during this time period, but we can get these snapshots. And we've been getting so much of this ice that we can actually build up some climate records. The first, I'm not going to show this slide. I'm not going to talk too much about the results in detail because there are several papers being written right now that should be submitted soon. But to give you a flavor of what we've been finding, this is going from 0 to 4.5 million years. The top is carbon dioxide. The middle is the ratio of deuterium to hydrogen, which you can think of as the temperature proxy. Then we have mean ocean temperature, which I haven't talked about, but it's based on the noble gas ratios in the air bubbles, which change as the ocean temperature changes, and because different noble gases have different solubilities. And then the bottom, the red and the gray are sea surface temperature record and benthic or the team. I won't talk about the data on the bottom. It's something from one of our Swiss colleagues. And so we're now able to reconstruct the atmospheric carbon dioxide going back, in this case, the CO2 data go back to about 2.7 million years on this plot. We have some older samples that have some complications. The temperature proxy record goes all the way back, mean ocean temperature back to about 3 million years. So we're seeing global cooling in mean ocean temperature. We're seeing cooling in the Antarctic temperature proxy, and the blue, green, and purple lines are ice core data from traditional ice cores. And so one of the takeaway messages is that carbon dioxide was low relative to those proxies, which are the gray spots on the upper diagram, within their range, so not outside of the uncertainty, but sort of in the low band. And the challenge we have is to understand what kind of averaging these data are doing. We think that the ice has been so deformed that we're probably averaging over glacial to interglacial cycles. And so that sort of fits with what we see where the data overlap with the regular ice core record. We're still working a little bit on trying to understand how much averaging there is and exactly how we should interpret that. But the current thinking now is that there's been a relatively slow decline in CO2. Didn't change too much across the mid-Pleistocene transition. And then the Antarctic temperature change and mean ocean temperature change sort of fit our conception of these variables, but this is the first time that we've ever seen this. And so there's a lot more work to be done on these and interpret them, but I think this is just a first flavor of what we're seeing from the Allen Hills. Somebody asked today if we'll find older ice. I don't know, but we'll certainly be looking. But I think our bigger challenge is to try to fill in some of the older spots on this diagram and fully interpret these records. There'll be 3 papers submitted in the next month or so, talking more about these data from Sarah Shackleton at Woods Hole and my student Julia Marks Peterson, who's working on the CO2 records. Okay, how much time do we have here? Okay, okay, so that's sort of what's happening with the long view, and I wanted to say a few words about some of our work on shorter timescales, because it kind of maybe connects to a little bit more to the modern climate change problem. So I'm going to talk about some of the things we have been working on over the past 20 years or so related to abrupt climate change, mostly during the last ice age, and it's sort of within the time period shown in that red box there. And so the next thing you'll see is another plot of wiggly lines, but it's going to be on this much shorter time scale. So this diagram is now bringing in data from both Antarctica and Greenland. So on the bottom in gray is this Antarctic temperature proxy. In this case, it's the oxygen 18-16 ratio of the ice in Antarctica, which is a proxy for temperature. And so you can see we're in the ice age here, and about 20,000 years ago, we started to warm up and reach the Holocene. This stops at 10,000 years. The red curve is atmospheric carbon dioxide. We looked at this part of it before, and if you look at the smaller scale wiggles in CO2 on this time frame, you'll see that they follow pretty well along with Antarctic temperature, which is a characteristic of atmospheric CO2 on most of these timescales. The upper part of this plot in blue is a temperature record from Greenland, also based on oxygen isotopes in ice. And if you followed along paleoclimatology over the last 30 years, this trace has become very familiar. This is the trace of what people call the Dansgaard-Usker cycles, or abrupt warmings and coolings that happened in Greenland repeatedly during the last ice age. And we've done a lot of work on understanding how these are linked to changes in ocean circulation. The green line is data that we produced from an ice core. It happens to be in Antarctica, and it's the atmospheric methane concentration in the atmosphere. And the atmospheric methane concentration follows very, very, very faithfully the Greenland ice core temperature record. So there's actually sort of these two greenhouse gases, which seem to move together when you're looking on the 800,000 year time scale, actually are not moving together when you look more closely. Methane follows Greenland temperature very, very closely. CO2 follows Antarctic temperature very closely. Now, we've spent a lot of time trying to understand what these variations are about, how the abrupt changes that we observe in Greenland, which are also happening in the northern hemisphere, are related to methane, and how all of that is related to what you see in Antarctica. So I'm going to take a closer look at just one little part of this figure. This particular time interval around 40,000 years, just to show you how much detail we can come up with. Sorry, here we go. So now if we just look at this time period, it's about a 7,000 year time period. We're looking at those abrupt warmings and coolings in Greenland. The amplitude of those things is equivalent to something like 10 degrees centigrade annual temperature change in Greenland. You can see how quickly the methane changes within a century or less on those timeframes. And you can see that this CO2 record sort of broadly following the Antarctic temperature trend, but actually also has an abrupt feature in it but that abrupt feature is not related to changes in Greenland. It seems to be something else. So in terms of the greenhouse effect of methane, these are small variations. They probably don't matter much to temperature. They happen quickly. I said they're synchronous with Greenland temperature change. There are these other little wiggles in here like in here, this particular feature doesn't look like much, but it happens right at the time that the CO2 changes. So we got kind of curious about it. And as I said, the CO2 follows Antarctic temperature. And if you look at this plot, you can see something we call the bipolar seesaw. If you look at the two temperature plots, you'll see that Antarctica is warming while Greenland is cold, and Antarctica starts to cool when Greenland warms. And that's actually a fairly consistent pattern in all of the Greenland Antarctic comparisons that we can make. The oldest Greenland ice core record goes back to about 125,000 years, so you can't look directly at this oscillation beyond that. So I want to say a few things about this that we sort of think about. One has to do just with the methane changes. When those were first observed, there was a lot of talk and a lot of uncertainty about what they meant. And one of the things that people tried to connect them to was methane in permafrost or methane in marine hydrates. These are archives of methane in the Earth system that are rather large. And there have been concerns over the years that global warming might accelerate the release of methane from those archives, from those reservoirs. And so you see things like this, methane time bomb, methane apocalypse, diffusing the Arctic's time bomb, and so on. And it turned out that, you know, the ice core record became pretty integral to trying to understand whether this was something that we should be worrying about, or if the alternative was happening, which is just that climate change was driving methane emissions from wetlands, which are sort of the standard place we think of methane coming from. And so one way to trace that is to measure carbon-14 in methane, and this work was done several years ago. The idea is that if you have old carbon coming from the seafloor or old permafrost reservoirs, it will be depleted in carbon-14. And if you have carbon coming from the modern ecosystem at the time, it will have carbon-14 equivalent to the C14 content of the atmosphere at that time. So our colleague Vas Petrenko, who's at Rochester, and his student Michael Dionysius did this incredible experiment where they collected samples that were 1,000 kilograms of ice each, and extracted the methane. Peter was there for part of this, extracted the methane to measure the radiocarbon. And what they find is shown on this diagram here. The data are in black. So as you go across one of these big transitions, methane rises significantly. The radiocarbon content essentially doesn't change. If you had dead carbon input, it would go down and look more like that brown line. And so this is pretty conclusive evidence that the permafrost and clathrate reservoir is not acting on these timescales. That's not to say that there might be a more chronic feedback on permafrost in the future, but it wasn't sort of the disaster scenario that people were talking about. What we think is happening instead, and there's, I think, lots of evidence that this is the way it works, is that first of all, in the climate end of things, the bipolar seesaw is caused by changes in ocean circulation that cool the northern hemisphere and warm the southern hemisphere. And that when you stop ocean circulation in the north, you'll induce that kind of pattern. And so the bipolar seesaw pattern can be reproduced in climate models, and it's consistent with a lot of other data. And so that sort of successfully explains the temperature differences between the hemispheres. We think that the methane concentrations changes are driven by changes in tropical hydrology. When you warm the northern hemisphere, you move northern hemisphere rain belts into the north. Larry Edwards, who's here, has done a lot of work on cave deposits that show that this is the case, and that increases methane emissions because there's more land in the northern hemisphere, tropics. And conversely, moving them southward impact methane emissions negatively and they go down. One of the hypotheses for explaining the CO2 increases during the times when we're in a cold period in Greenland, it is a hypothesis that the southern hemisphere westerly winds move associated with bipolar seesaw. So when you have warm conditions in the northern hemisphere, westerlies move northward. When you have cold conditions in the northern hemisphere, westerly winds move southward. And the southward movement is believed to impact upwelling which brings CO2 to the surface and to the atmosphere. And so this is one idea that fits most of the evidence. And I'll say a little bit more about an alternative here in a minute. One of the things that's interesting about this CO2 history is that the picture here is quite abrupt. So we're looking at a very sharp change in CO2. And it turns out that this appears to coincide with a time period called Heinrich Event 4. And if you're not familiar with Heinrich events, there were big iceberg discharges that happened in the North Atlantic that represent a major sort of surge of ice that is also believed to impact the climate system by sort of making an extreme version of a cold period up there on the left. And that sort of consistently seems to coincide with these sharp increases in atmospheric CO2. And these have become interesting just because they're so, well, not just because, but in part because they're very fast. They're probably the fastest changes in natural changes in greenhouse gases that we've observed. And that this was described in great detail in a very recent paper by Katie Wendt, who is actually a graduate of this college. She got her undergraduate degree here and graduate degree here with Larry Edwards. And what Katie did, I won't try to talk about all the data on this diagram, but she looked in a huge amount of detail at all of these CO2 changes. And the fastest one she found is the one that I was showing you data for before. So she gets about 14 ppm increase in atmospheric CO2 in about 5 decades. And so that's slower than what's happening now, but it's pretty fast. I think it's maybe 5 times faster than the current increase over the last century. So it's not just a slow change, there's quick things happening associated with these ice drafted events and ocean circulation that's sort of driving the climate system, and we think maybe driving the CO2 patterns. However, there's an alternative hypothesis, and that is that the land biosphere is involved. And I won't go into that in the interest of time. I won't go into this in too much detail, but I just wanted to show this one more figure about something we're working on, which I think is kind of cool. These are 3 of those events where methane changes really quickly. So this is right at the end of the ice age. This is the time period we're just looking at, and this is an older one. And this is that time period where Katie's finding the super fast CO2 changes. And the sort of brownish diamonds are the isotopic composition of methane. This is a very hard measurement to make, as a student in my lab did this. And the idea was to sort of understand what was happening with methane at these times. And, it might seem a little weird to be interested in these very tiny peaks here, but it turns out that that's when the CO2 is changing, so we thought it was interesting. And again, I'll just focus your attention on this sort of middle plot here. This is that event that we're seeing, and there's this odd little isotopic anomaly. Methane gets a little heavier, more carbon-13. And so the simple way to interpret that is that that's because of wildfire. It's the only isotopic source of methane, this is carbon isotopes and hydrogen isotopes, that would drive methane that way is what we call biomass burning or forest fire. And so we are hypothesizing that there's actually a terrestrial biosphere response in the fire regime on about 50-year time frame when all of these switches are happening. And my idea is that the tropical rain belts are actually moving and leaving behind biomass that then burns. I can't prove that because it's not something that anybody does in a model, and we can't really see other paleoclimate archives on that short a time scale yet. But I think this may have some relevance to what fire regimes can do if we really push the tropical hydrologic system pretty hard in one direction. During El Nino, you get a lot of burning, maybe certain analogy there, but we're following up on this pattern now, hopefully with more detailed measurements. And anyway, it's something fascinating to me, so I thought I'd put it in here. I'm gonna stop here, I think, in the interest of time, and try to answer questions or elaborate as needed. And if you're of a certain age, you've seen the movie Spinal Tap, and you may glean something about this image from that.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, we have time for questions here, 15 or 20 minutes, and then we can bleed over into like refreshments outside there. There's a Q&A on Zoom that I'll be watching. And if I could have some volunteers to help run around a microphone for anybody who has a question for Ed.
So great presentation, just blown away by a lot of what you presented today. So you're studying climate change using ice. Climate change is melting ice. How has climate change affected your ability to do what you do?
Okay, that's a really cool question. I will give an answer, and Peter may also have an answer. But so in Antarctica, not much. You know, it's cold enough there that certainly in interior East Antarctica, we would probably expect more snowfall as it gets a little bit warmer. And I don't think we've really seen any impact on the work in the coring sites. There actually, it does feel like it's been a little bit warmer at McMurdo Station, and that has actually affected aircraft operations and ice runways and things like that. But not so much for these interior ice core sites. Now, people like Lonnie Thompson at Ohio State, or people who are going into more temperate or even tropical mountain regions, their archives are melting, right? Mount Kilimanjaro is, you know, the ice at the surface is old because it's melting away. So from that perspective, ice core scientists are losing. There's a really cool project called Ice Memory, which is originated in Europe. And they're drilling cores in the Alps and other places, and they're actually taking them to Dome C and storing them there because it's a cheap refrigerator.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, top next. I was curious to hear your perspective on, to what extent do you think we're leveraging the full sort of suite of things we could measure in ice bubbles? Are there other other tracers that you
Absolutely.
about?
Yeah, and certainly I talk about ice core gases would go into a lot more detail. There are limits, right? Because anything that's going to react with water at those temperatures isn't going to be present anymore. But in the gas records, you know, in addition to the N2 or N2O, methane, CO2, there are a few groups that work on what they call ultra trace gases. So propane, ethane, acetylene. Eric Saltzman is one of those people at UC Irvine. It's very, very hard, but carbon monoxide can be measured. We've gotten better at that. When we started out, it was difficult. It still has pretty significant blank problems in some ice cores. There's a lot of interactions with dust, that dusty ice actually not sure it produces gases, but the dust is maybe carrying absorbed gases and causing problems. But anyway, all of those sort of long-lived gases, depending on your perspective, can be measured. And I think the CO and propane, ethane, et cetera, can tell us something about fire and geological emissions. Their lifetimes are shorter, as you know, which means that what you measure in Greenland and what you measure in Antarctica may be telling you different things. Same thing for CO. There's just not as big a suite of those measurements yet in all the different ice cores. Nobody has one analytical system that measures all that stuff. We should do that, but it's kind of hard. And then in terms of other things to measure, I mean, we talked about this earlier, but you know, there are a number of things like nitrate, sulfate, isotopic composition of sulfate, triple oxygen isotopic composition of O2. There's been quite a lot of work on chemical tracers. I think we're still trying to understand what some of them mean, but sulfate, for example, the mass independent fractionation of oxygen and sulfate turns out to be a really interesting tracer of whether an eruption reached the stratosphere or not. So that's, you know, one example of a cool tracer.
Good question about volcanic activity. In the kind of large scheme of things, in changes in climate, and can you talk a little bit about that? How does that impact, or if it impacts what you see in those ice cores?
Yeah, so we know a great deal about volcanic history from ice cores, so both from measuring sulfur as a tracer of eruptions and also for more nearby eruptions, actual physical particles. I think one of the really interesting data sets from ice cores is that by looking at the sulfate records, you can actually see the cooling related to big eruptions. You know, you can see, for example, Pinatubo shows up, older eruptions show up, and you get, it's particularly evident in the Greenland records, you know, a couple of years of short-term cooling following major eruptions. So they've been extraordinarily useful for dating too, both in terms of finding the patterns of known eruptions to get absolute age, but also for synchronizing cores. For example, you can synchronize the ice cores across Antarctica with sulfur records, and that's very powerful dating tool.
Thank you very much. This is a raw and potentially ignorant question, so bear with me. So, if Antarctic ice is essentially currently healthy enough that you can carry out your research successfully without worrying about a loss of ice, and anecdotally and through some data, you're suggesting, you know, we're not seeing much of a warming effect in Antarctica, then tells me that the continent, and we knew this, right, isn't super representative of global climate trends. And so I understand, you know, you're collecting data that helps you kind of understand what the global climate was doing historically. And I'm just wondering how we can sort of square these pieces to make inferences about not just global climate, but even regional climates. What other information would you need to be able to be more precise in helping people understand not just that globally it was warmer, but here's maybe what it meant in these areas?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things. When we go to ice core sites, we're going to places that are pretty cold, and there aren't actually very many true temperature records for the last 100 years from Antarctica. Very few. I think we are concerned about the West Antarctic ice sheet in terms of warming, like, there are places in Antarctica that are changing, they're just not the places we're going to get ice cores, except for Peter. I mean, and maybe you wanna comment on that aspect of the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have real challenges with modern climate in Antarctica. So, paleoclimate to me in Antarctica, it actually not only includes the last few million years, but the last few decades to the last 100 to 200 years. We don't have any instrumental observations of climate, say anywhere on the left-hand coast of West Antarctica, there, the West Antarctic coastline. So that's where Julia and I and a team of South Koreans were out in the middle of nowhere for 2 weeks. Drilling an ice core here because in this critical region where glaciers are starting to change in response to ocean change, we have no climate records. And Bird stations here with a 50 to 70-year long climate record, and we have absolutely no climate records until you get all the way up there higher than I can jump. And so we're trying to just reconstruct modern climate as well. And it is starting to get warm. A little warmer out there. Again, we don't know what the 100-year temperature trend is on the coast of West Antarctica. So pretty basic questions we're still trying to ask and answer.
And the other part of your question, I'm not sure I got, but, I don't think there's any, if you were asking if there's any sort of inconsistency between seeing warming on the rest of the world and not seeing so much warming here, I don't think so. I mean, this is a very icy place and it's one of the colder places in the world, and some of the feedbacks that you get on warming probably aren't happening yet. But that might not have been the spirit of your question, I'm not sure.
I think the question was actually,
Yeah.
do we need the microphone for people online? And we
Well,
can-
usually not for you, Kenny, but in this case, yes.
Sorry. The question was really more about climate dynamics in general.
Hmm.
One of the kind of holy grail, something we were talking about over lunch, is that what people really want to know is, when you're looking at decision makers, resource management agencies and things like that, it actually does come down to the weather. They actually want to know, how many times is it going to rain at this magnitude, and how much snow are we going to get, how many freeze-thaw cycles are we going to have, and things like that. And so you have this wonderful resource, this long global record. And ultimately, if we could see it all the way through, what we'd be able to do is turn that into information.
Yeah, sure.
Tell us about not just the global climate, but regional and even localized conditions. And I guess the second part was really, how can we push this to its extreme?
Yeah. I mean, maybe one point to make and it's not really my field, but right, is that we're really worried about all of this. If the West Antarctic ice sheet and parts of the West Antarctic ice sheet are believed to be threatened, and that's about sea level more than it's about temperature, right? So maybe Minnesota doesn't matter, but like to the place where my grandfather built a cottage 70 years ago in New York, it matters a lot. If some of the more extreme predictions of, a meter of sea level change rapidly if we have an ice sheet failure were actually true. So, I mean, to me, that is the bigger, maybe in some ways, the bigger proximal issue right now for Antarctica, connecting the sea level picture. And that's, doesn't come as directly out of ice cores, although some people think that at the last interglacial period, the last time it was, about as warm as it is now, part of the West Antarctic ice sheet collapsed. And it turns out that you think that we would know, but the records of that are ambiguous. There is an American project gearing up to drill an ice core somewhere over here on this side, so not in here, but just off the West Antarctic ice sheet in a place where we think that the climate conditions in the atmosphere would have felt it if there was open water in West Antarctica. And There's a lot tied up in that statement that I just made, but if that turns out to be useful, then we would have a more direct record of the collapse. And I think that, you know, if you wanted one thing you could take from Antarctic research, that might be pretty important.
Yeah, I think we need one more question.
Yeah.
One more.
What's your best wild ass guess as to where it's going from here, the bubbles, the key elements that you're making?
Great
Where are we
question.
going the next 100 years?
Great question. My wild ass guess about CO2 levels 100 years from now. You know, I'm not a political scientist. I think you have to be a political and social science to answer that question. It's got nothing to do with physical science. It's all about what we choose. Right? If we choose to keep burning fossil fuels at the current rate, I think we're probably up to about 700, 800 ppm. That would be the standard prediction. That's like the business as usual scenario. I think it's pretty unlikely that we could keep it below 500. Just based on my own, you know, personal predictions about politics and energy. And that, I think we'd be doing pretty good. If we could do that. And in order to do that, we have to change how we do transportation and energy yesterday.
That's a nice broad answer to the last question.
But we can't change it yesterday, but we do. I mean, I am an optimist about the technology of about energy technology. I think we do know the way forward. It may be a little bit too late to keep this down where we really would want it, but we can stop. And yeah, the non-rosy perspective though is that it takes about 100,000 years for this to go away. And so it is actually a problem we need to get a hold of. Methane will go away fast though. If you turn off the methane sources, it'll be gone in a few decades. So there's a good thing we can do.
I mean, there is a lot of good news there and relating to our understanding of these systems,
Yeah.
ISO records, that we know what's going on. We know how to make it less bad in the future. So there's agency there, and we all need to work together to make sure we're making choices that start to, well, you know, a couple of years ago, we were talking about flattening the curve, right? You know, we need to get emissions under control, and that's completely within our capabilities. To make the choice. Thanks again, Ed, for joining us.
Thank you all.
Speaker this year. We'll move outside for conversation.
My name.